Many of you will know our speaker from his 29 years as the City of London Corporation's Chief Planning Officer, and I think it's fair to say that his reputation precedes him. This is a man who's done more to shape the city skyline over the past 3 decades than anybody else, enabling the development of the gherkin, the cheese grater, and the walkie-talkie, to name just 3. He's never been afraid to share his opinion, and now, as Professor of Places and City Planning at the UCL Faculty of the Built Environment, he has no professional constraints at all over what he might say. So hopefully we're in for a treat. Backed by popular demand, please welcome to the stage the real Peter Rees.
And I want to start by talking about wax. Not ruby wax or beeswax or floor wax. I want to talk about earwax. Because I don't know whether I'm the only person, but around this time of year, my ears seem to want to go into hibernation. And over the last few days, I'd had problems with one of my ears and wax building up, to the point today where I actually went and got drops to put in my ear. And I have to say, it hasn't worked, because when I come to these dinners, I usually like to be deaf in both ears. I find it makes the dinner go so much better. This evening, I'm only deaf in the one. So I have had dinner conversation. But I do find that at these events that it can help if you're in some way impaired to the point where you can't hear all that's going on around you. But nevertheless, you do pick up some interesting stuff. And it's given me the opportunity to reacquaint myself with how important the press and the media have been to me throughout my career. Now, the English shy away from the press. I've never understood that because I'm a Welshman. You never have to ask a Welshman how clever they are or how good they are. I mean, we indigenous British people, we native British people, are perfectly happy to tell the later immigrants, you know, the people from the Romans through to the Romanians that became the English, how much we belong here and how much we appreciate the island and how pleased we are to share it with all of you. We're not shrinking violets. In many ways, we're like the Irish. And in fact, I don't know whether you realise, but there is only one difference between the Irish and the Welsh. They were the ones that could swim when the English arrived. The Welsh, unfortunately, we didn't have that skill, and we were stuck in that western peninsula. But as a Welshman, it gave me great pleasure when I took up my post in the City of London in 1985, just as they announced the Big Bang deregulation of financial services, to realise that I was the second Celtic planning officer of the square mile. The first, of course, was Boudicca. She didn't like classical architecture either, and she burnt down the Romans' first attempt at a city of London. Unfortunately, they rebuilt it, and the rest, as they say, is history. But although she was a Celt, she was a good Romford girl as well. You know, and a good Romford girl likes a bit of a punch-up, revels in it. And those Essex Celts, as they were in those days, had at least a hand in the early years of shaping the City of London. A little bit different in 1985, of course. I inherited somewhere that was much quieter. In fact, it was far too quiet. In 1985, and this is going to come as a shock, I'm glad you're all sitting down because to a journalist this is really shocking. In 1985, all the city pubs closed at 8:30 in the evening. Exactly. I mean, how on earth could you have done your work? It'd be impossible, wouldn't it? And those were the era, of course, when you only ever gave a newspaper or a journalist a quote in the morning. Because after lunch, you'd never write, I mean, even The Guardian, well, The Guardian was the only one that got it right after lunch, of course. All the others completely garbled. It was completely wasted to talk to a journalist in the afternoon, because they were completely wasted. But before lunch, that was fine. In fact, they usually wanted to take you to lunch. So you had to work out whether you actually wanted them to remember what you were saying or make it up. I mean, in my case, sometimes it was better if they did make it up. And at least, of course, if they'd made it up, you could then deny it. So there was a whole complex politics of dealing with the press in those days. But my not first contact with the press, because in my previous jobs in central government and then in Lambeth, we'd courted the press. You know, we'd try and get something at the bottom of a column, you know, anything in the newspaper. Oh, we've got some publicity. I was appointed in the city, and before I took up the job, they just kicked out the Mies van der Rohe tower for number 1 poultry. The public inquiry had kicked it out. And immediately the press were on to me. They'd heard I'd been appointed. I was telephoned down in Lambeth. Well, what will you do then? What will you do on the site at number 1 poultry? I said, I don't know, but I do know it's a triangle. I do know it has to fit the site, and it's not a tower with a square. So that was the sort of first run-in. And that went fairly well. That's what they said. Peter Rees says it should be a triangle. I thought, that was lucky. And then it started to get a little bit more complicated. I can remember an occasion, well, some of you will remember, although not most. We seem to have a lot of the work experience people in this evening, judging by the average age of some of the people in the room, or is it just me getting older? I'm not sure. But a lot of you won't remember the 1990s. But in the 1990s, some of my Celtic cousins came across from Ireland to help with the regeneration of the city and planted a couple of bombs and blew up some quite undistinguished Grade B office space, which was rebuilt at the expense of the insurers and came back on stream just at the point where we had another boom. Worked quite well, actually. They did the same for Manchester. Manchester's never looked back since the IRA took an interest in it. I always thought it was counterintuitive that they had the completely opposite effect from the one they were trying to have on the city or Manchester. But anyway, after the first of the bombs went off, Tower 42, or it was still NatWest Tower in those days, was badly damaged. All the glass came down, piles of rubble everywhere. Telephone call from the Evening Standard. Mira Bar Hillel. Do you remember their conservation correspondent? Mrs. Hill from Wimbledon. She used to write to the paper under that name, and they used to print her letters. Anyway, Mira rang me, and she said, NatWest Tower, she said, badly damaged. She said, what should we do? I said, well, I don't know. We haven't looked at how badly damaged it is. I said, it may be superficial. But I said, I do know one thing. If it's got to come down, we should rebuild it. We shouldn't be cowed by terrorism. I walked out of the office that lunchtime, and in those days, they used to have newsstands. Do you remember the time when you used to have to pay for the Evening Standard? I know it's bizarre, isn't it? But in those days, you had those newsstands with the billboard on the front, with the headline, written up in hand script. And the headline on the billboards that lunchtime, on the first edition of the Standard, said, "Why the NatWest Tower must come down, city planner." Well, the chairman of NatWest wasn't terribly amused. Neither were my bosses at the City Corporation. But it alerted me to the fact that when you talk to some journalists, you have to make sure that they can't actually edit it in a way that makes totally different sense. Maggie Thatcher was the one that always got that right. Apparently, when she did a television interview, if they ever did a cut and a retake, she would change her woolen cardigan. And she'd say, OK, we'll start again then, shall we? So they couldn't intercut. But intercutting is certainly something that I experienced once or twice over the years, but with very few. Because I've found over the years that I've had very little trouble with the professional press. And if I have, it's always been my own fault for saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment, being in the bad mood, or for not explaining things clearly. The problem you get is when it's a journalist that doesn't expect to see you again. If it's a journalist that wants to stay on the right side of you because they might need you again in future, they're generally very good. Now, this can get to extreme lengths. There was one Friday evening, about 6 o'clock, where I was still in my office in the city. Phone went. A journalist who shall remain nameless, who was a senior correspondent on the Financial Times, said to me, I'm doing an article about, I can't even remember what the subject was, it was something to do with finance, for tomorrow's Saturday FT. He said, would you like to give me a quote? I said, well, I'd find it difficult because I don't even understand what it is you're talking about. He said, oh, that's difficult. He said, I've tried everybody. He said, if I was to say, and he said something, would you agree with that? I said, well, I wouldn't disagree with it because I don't understand it. And he said, well, would you be prepared to say that? I said, well, would it help you? He said, oh, gosh, yes, enormously. Yes, I want to get home. I said, oh, all right, then I'll say that. So, following day, I was doing my usual thing, pushing the trolley around Waitrose. And I don't normally buy a Saturday FT, but I was passing the newspapers, and I glanced at the FT, and there on the front page, at the top of the page, with a quote in the middle of it, boxed in, and headlined with my name at the bottom, was the article. And I rang this guy on a Monday, and I said, what on earth was going on? I said, you didn't tell me that was going to be on the front page of the FT worldwide. He said, no, he said, it was meant to be in the business supplement. He said, I didn't know it was going to be in the front page. We didn't have anything else. So again, it brought it home to me that it doesn't really matter as long as they spell your name right. You can get coverage, provided you're prepared to work with the media. You guys, you girls have got hard jobs to do. You need headlines, you need jokes, you need a bit of entertainment to lighten your lives, and you need people that aren't frightened of you. It's been very few occasions where we've crossed swords because usually I've cocked up in something I've said, but it's worth it just for the one occasion in my life where I found myself sitting on a district line train in the evening rush hour, knowing that I had a 3/4 page photograph on one page of the Standard, looking round the train and waiting for people to get to that page. The trouble with London commuters is they never look up. It's so bloody frustrating to get a picture in the newspaper, especially when it's saying something nice about you and nobody even notices you're there. So you see how elusive fame can be. But it's important to remember that you can't achieve anything if it doesn't connect. There's no point in having the world's best joke, there's no point in having the world's best story to tell, there's no point in creating the best places or the best buildings unless people find out about it. And if it isn't a case that the people doing these things are connecting with those who can communicate it, we get nowhere. We are symbiotic, which is a Welsh word apparently. It's a word meaning that we've got to work together because it's in our interest to do so. So it's great to have woken up early enough to be with you this evening, and above all, to save you from another Peter Murray impression of me. Thank you very much. Good night.